In this episode, I'm going to be demonstrating FubuMVC.Validation, showing off the default out-of-the-box conventions and some basic setup for very common validation scenarios. I'm going to be using Fubu in Action, which is a public GitHub repository from the Darth FubuMVC account. Let's go ahead and dive in. Fubu in Action gives you some very basic functionality for managing a set of albums using RavenDB in the background. Just to recap, this is a list of the albums that we currently have, and this is a screen for creating a new album. You enter the artist and the name, that redirects you to the edit screen where you can provide additional information such as genre, release date. If I go back to the main screen, you'll see that the album is now listed. Unfortunately, we're currently not doing any validation whatsoever, so if I create a brand new album without information, it gets added and you can see this empty piece right here. Looking at the code, you'll see that when we create an album, which is right here, we simply take in a create album model, construct the new album, and update the repository. Once we're done with that, we go ahead and redirect to this method right here. Now, the create album class is very simplistic. It has an artist property and a name property. And here is our form. We're using Spark bindings to make the syntax just a little bit easier to read. So we provide an edit for the artist and the name and a submit button. What I'm going to do is initialize my package manager console, and I'm going to install the FubuMVC.Validation package. Okay, now that that is installed, there are a few different ways to specify validation for your models. The standard approach that most people are familiar with is an attribute-based. So I'm going to annotate my properties with the required attribute from FubuValidation, build. And now let's go back to our create album screen. Clicking submit, you'll see that I get errors for artist and name. No configuration required whatsoever. You'll also note that when I refresh this page, we get a slew of JavaScript dependencies that come in that are injected by FubuMVC.Validation. And all I did was simply annotate my properties. The other approach, if you are not fond of attributes like I am not, is to create what we call an override class. There's a class in FubuMVC.Core that provides accessor overrides. Accessors are simply an abstraction over property declarations. So I'm going to say that my create album overrides inherits overrides for create album class, and in here I can declaratively state that for this particular property it is required. All of these are simply extension methods provided by FubuMVC.Validation, and you can easily add your own as well. So no more attributes. We'll build this, refresh, and we'll see that they still get picked up. There's a little bit of magic involved. Anything that implements overrides for is automatically registered into your container. It's picked up by FubuMVC, and FubuMVC.Validation has a chance to evaluate everything that is declared. So, that's it. Install FubuMVC.Validation, and here are your default conventions. Another common scenario that you run into writing validation is server-side validation rules. So these are rules that have to execute on the server side, and it gets complicated when you have to duplicate the logic between your server-side code and your client-side code. Luckily, FubuMVC.Validation has a simple solution for this. We call these remote validation rules. So let's create a constraint that says that all album titles must be unique. We're going to make use of a simple marker interface called iRemoteFieldValidation rule. So what we'll do is pull out the value that we're concerned with of the title. We're going to pull a service out of the context. More on this later. Now, we're going to check against all albums and see if any album exists against the title. And we're going to ignore case. Just so everyone can read this. Now what we're going to do is add that rule to our accessor overrides. We're going to build and refresh. Note that we have Josh Arnold untitled, so let's go ahead and try to create that one more time. And we'll pull up our networking tab. And we'll see that the album is already in use. And in our resources tab, you'll see that we get a response back from the server. A very simple payload. Another common validation scenario is configuring the way that messages are displayed client-side. Currently, we display a validation summary at the top with the messages displayed in an unordered list. Other common approaches include highlighting the element or placing the message right beside the element. These three scenarios are supported by FubuMVC.Validation right out of the box. The default is to include the validation summary and highlight the element. Right now, we don't have any CSS to back it, but you'll notice that the errored elements have the error CSS class. What we're going to do is demonstrate how to configure the way that the messages are displayed and include the inline message as well. We can do this by configuring the settings for validation. Now, for this particular example, I'm going to modify the create album validation configuration specifically. What I want to do is register a strategy and I want to include inline validation messages. I'm going to build that, refresh, And now you'll see that the messages are included inline. I can also change this and clear out all the existing strategies and just do inline. If you needed to do this conventionally, we have a few additional overrides that allow you to match on behavior chains or input types. The input types, I could simply say true and have this apply to everything. Or I can constrain it to a particular predicate, like a marker interface or models that end in inline, models that contain inline, any convention that you can think of. A common validation scenario is to use an AJAX submit in the background instead of doing a complete post back. FubuMVC uses a very common standardized approach to AJAX called the AJAX continuation. What I'm going to do is change from the Fubu continuation to the AJAX continuation. And what we're going to do, never mind the mechanics of the redirect, we're going to completely change how this application works. We're going to create an AJAX continuation that's successful, indicating that the entity did persist. And maybe we'll smuggle the entity down back into a JSON response. We're going to build that. And without any further configuration, we're going to reload the page and inspect our network tab. Validation kicks in. We'll create another untitled album, click submit, and you'll see that an AJAX post happened when validation succeeded. And our response has the new album that was created. This has been a brief introduction into FubuMVC.Validation. Be on the lookout for additional episodes diving into advanced scenarios, configuration details, and how to extend it with your own custom rules.